For 20 years, we've been creating innovation in the CX industry, and now we're seeking out brilliant new perspectives on CX you just won't find anywhere else. I'm Richard Owen. Welcome to the CX Iconoclast. My friend and CX pioneer, Mauricio Duarte, recently invited me to record an interview for his executive audiences in Latin America. Now, Mauricio is based in beautiful Bogota, Colombia, but his consulting firm, Opinat, has been instrumental in helping enterprise across the entire region implement successful CX programs. We didn't prearrange any of the questions, which I think makes the interview perhaps more spontaneous and hopefully better for you, the audience. But we did cover some of the key lessons from 20 years now of Net Promoter Score and CX programs, together with, as you can imagine, discussions around the future use of artificial intelligence in the customer experience world. As the interview ran for an hour, we've broken it up into two parts. I do hope you enjoy our conversation.
Okay, well, it's a pleasure being here with Richard Owen, one of the godfathers of the NPS system. Richard, what a pleasure being here with you.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation, Mauricio.
No, not at all. Richard, it is amazing what you've done for the past, I think, 2 decades regarding customer experience in the NPS. And giving this 2025, I would like to have your vision of what's going on in the CX world regarding AI, the evolution of NPS. But before we go into those topics, I always like to talk about the person. So why did you start it in the CX business? Why? What did you study? How did you came about all this?
Well, thank you. That's a long story. As you say, I've been in the CX industry for 20 years. And I really got interested in customer experience before that when I was a general manager at Dell Computer Corporation. And back then, we're in the PC business, you can imagine, and the PC business is a very competitive industry. There wasn't a lot to differentiate one manufacturer from the other. So I had as a general manager, I'm running a business, I'm trying to generate revenues and profits. And it became obvious that the company really understood this idea that customer experience was a differentiator. So it wasn't my day job thinking about customer experience, but it became very clear that this was a winning strategy for the company. And I got very interested in it back then. And you fast forward maybe 4 or 5 years, I'd been involved in taking one technology company public. I was looking for my next leadership position, and the opportunity at Satmetrix came up. And I'd heard stories at the time about how Siebel Systems had been using this technology to really transform itself from being very product-centric to very customer-centric. So it struck me as a really exciting opportunity to get involved in something that I'd seen as a concept work and now seemed to be applied to technology companies in very interesting and new ways. And I'd wrestled with this challenge in every business I'd run. How do you know that you're capable of creating great customer outcomes? And so the idea of being on the sell side of that, sort of building technologies that would solve that problem, seemed pretty natural to me. So I got drawn into it through that route.
Okay, great. And how did you get involved with the NPS methodology? A lot of people confuse it with just a score, but we know it's an overall strategy and a methodology. How did you came about it, and how did you got involved with Fred Richfield in this topic?
So when I joined Satmetrix, Fred Reichelt was one of the board members already. He'd been recruited to the board, and he was working with the head of research and development, Dr. Laura Brooks, on a methodology. And they were pretty much at the late stage of putting the finishing touches on this. They'd been looking for data sets that correlated financial and economic outcomes with customer loyalty objectives. And so Fred and Laura had done most of the really heavy lifting around this, sort of building out the data science part of it. And in 2003, the Harvard Business Review article came out, which was the one number you need to grow, which I think a lot of us at the time felt was a massive oversimplification of the concept. But Harvard really wanted this to be done in a simple to understand method. And you can argue that they were right because they dumbed it down in so many ways, but it caught people's imagination. What became obvious when this started to take off, and lots of companies said that NPS is a really interesting idea as a metric, was that it was pretty ineffective as simply a metric. It was not the case that a lot of companies were going to get great success from just thinking about this as a survey question. And there were a lot of misconceptions at the time that I think, in some extent, we'd been responsible for creating. For example, the idea that survey questionnaires should be, 2-question surveys. There was no empirical basis behind that. Nobody had ever proven that was a good idea. It was just a concept. The idea that it was highly efficient to follow up with every detractor in a business, that was just a concept. There was no empirical basis behind it. So really over the next 4 or 5 years, really leading up to sort of 2008 when Answering the Ultimate Question, our book got published, and also we launched the whole certification initiative, we were spending time looking at what companies were doing in practice and sort of building this out into a much more significant set of disciplines, which included the right kind of way to structure surveys to get the right kind of analytics, included the right types of business process, how to engage leadership, how to run companies, how to link this to financials. And so for me, NPS as a broader methodology really developed over those years and sort of got launched much more towards the sort of 2008 timeframe. And at that point, we were able to give companies, I think, much more of a playbook for creating proper NPS programs. And that's not to say, Mauricio, that everyone got that right at that point. And to this day, I think you still have NPS programs that run the spectrum from highly sophisticated, well understood, change-oriented programs within companies to almost trivialized efforts to just ask a couple of survey questions, try and generate a score and say, oh, this is how we're doing. And so you have the full breadth across the entire continuum.
Okay, great. And given the length of the time that you've been involved with NPS methodology, and you gave us already an idea of what seems to work and doesn't really work. What would be your recommendations for people all across Latin America and corporations that have got NPS as their KPI and their methodology as part of their business strategy? What are things that work, that you've seen that really work, and what are the greatest pitfalls and the greatest mistakes up to this point?
Right. Well, we could spend a couple of hours on that topic. Let me start at the high level. First of all, congratulations. I think the idea that you're committing your organization to long-term success through delighting customers is a really important idea. And if you're doing that, then you've taken the first most important step. And I want to emphasize the word commitment because it's an act of leadership to say to your organization, we're going to focus on this. This is an important variable within our business. It's as important, perhaps, maybe not as important as profits or growth of profitability, but it's something that we're going to keep front and center year after year after year as kind of one of the family rules for our business. And I'm going to hold my whole organization accountable for this. It's a critical metric. We're going to own it. We're going to understand what level of performance we need to achieve with it. And I'm going to drive the organization to achieve that level of performance. That's sort of rule number one. Let's use metrics as a control mechanism for the organization, as an accountability mechanism. And let's, as a leadership team, get behind explaining why. Short-term profitability may be different than long-term profitability. Long-term profitability will be best served by taking care of our customers and creating great customer relationships. And we're going to lead our company to achieve that. So rule number one is start at the top with a very clear message and commitment to accountability and measurement. And if you've taken that first step, I don't mean to say that you're sort of halfway there, but you've achieved a sort of foundational level from which you can then go and accomplish great things. If you haven't done that, if you say, well, NPS is a metric we want to publish for the media, or it's a little research project on the side, or we're going to look at it once a year, then it means nothing. It's just a waste of time. It takes that leadership commitment for any company that's successful. I think the second big rule I would say is think of the Net Promoter Score as a critical KPI for the business, but not necessarily a product of surveying. I don't think the association with the survey mechanism is terribly healthy. What you want, if you have any KPI for the company, is you want the best possible way of calculating that KPI. And by best possible, I mean the most accurate, the most complete, the most comprehensive. And that's going to change over time with technology waves. And we're going to talk about artificial intelligence. But even within the survey world, before AI, the way in which we would accurately generate Net Promoter Score was evolving. And so the metric today is not the metric it was 20 years ago. The metric's still the key thing, but the way you calculate it and how you create better ways of looking at it is really instrumental. So the second thing I would say is don't be locked into the technology, be locked into the metric, and don't think of the metric as being associated with the technology. It's not a survey question. It's a data point. The third thing I would say is any metric is of very low value if you don't understand the diagnostic. And by that, I mean, why? Why is the metric what it is? And I think this is where a lot of companies have gone wrong. They've measured something, but they don't really understand why that number is what it is. So if you're creating promoters or creating detractors, and you don't have a really good understanding of what it is about your operations that's creating those outcomes, what are you going to do? I mean, at some level, you're going to look at the number and say, well, it's up or it's down or it's flat, but we don't know what to do. And so to create action, to create momentum within the company, you really need two things. You need accountability, as we already said, but you need diagnosis. You need an ability to fully understand what it is and why you have these numbers the way they're shaping up. And that diagnosis comes from a number of sources. You want to be able to link to operational data. You want to be able to understand why your business operations are creating these outcomes. You want to understand how these outcomes affect financials. And you want to understand what the root cause of these outcomes are. So really, that's the third key thing, build good diagnostics. And the final thing I would say is start to embrace the idea of process within the organization. So if you have a customer that's identified as a detractor, what are you going to do? How are you going to engage the organization? How are your sales teams going to engage? What information are you going to give them to enable them to take good actions? How are you going to learn from those actions? How do you get the entire organization moving forward around this? And that's a combination of process, systems, data, and also incentives and accountability. So those are really the sort of top-down things that you could summarize as being the big lessons. And a lot of it you could say is true for any management measurement system of any kind, whether it's financial or operational or Net Promoter Score. But a lot of companies don't get those fundamentals right, and they're disappointed by the results.
Great advice, Richard. Regarding the challenge that most organizations face to quote unquote sell the importance of customer centricity is some argue is the lack of the economics, the understanding of what really impacts the bottom line in a company. And that's my conclusion. But I would like to hear you regarding what are the challenges from the operation and from the CX division, to say it that way, to communicate with the C-level of the company. What makes sense? What has worked?
So you're absolutely right that at the end of the day, this is making an economic argument. I mean, companies adopt Net Promoter Score really for two reasons. One is that there is a philosophical commitment to this from the leadership team. So if you look at, for example, Charles Schwab, who was one of the earliest adopters of NPS, the big American brokerage house, Charles Schwab himself, Charles Schwab the man, not just the company, Charles Schwab said, we are committed to creating the best possible company for our customers. We're going to measure that through NPS. That's it. I'm in charge. You can debate it. You can say whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. I don't care. This is how we're running the company. And so you get that kind of charismatic leader saying, this is how we roll. This is our family rules. If you don't like it, don't come and work for Charles Schwab. And that happens in a lot of companies. The charismatic leader says it's critical that we create long-term customer success. This is my set of rules for it. Now, the other group of companies, you could argue, are a little more skeptical, and they want proof, and they want economic connection. They want to understand, how does this impact profitability? How does this impact loss or growth, whatever the economic outcome? Call it all customer lifetime value, because at some level, it's all CLTV. And for that organization, they want to start to see data that links the impact on creating better customers with other financial metrics, whether that's retention, maybe churn-oriented metrics, maybe that's lifetime value, upsell, cross-sell, whatever you have. And there's two challenges associated with that. The first is, do you have data that's of the required quality and diagnostics of the required depth that enable you to make those connections? Because if the way you create NPS is very poor, then it's not going to connect to anything. So if your disciplines around generating the metric are wrong, you generate the wrong metrics, and it's not going to make any impact to anything. And a lot of what companies call NPS is not really a very effective way of measuring it, so it's not going to link to financials. The other problem is that they don't know how to generate clear linkage between financial outcomes and their promoter score. And in some ways, it's kind of our fault, Mauricio, because what we did originally was we established a very industry-level macroeconomic linkage between NPS and growth. We said, oh, within this industry, NPS leaders beat non-leaders. And Bain continues to generate some really exceptional reporting and analysis that show that NPS leaders continue to outperform at a very aggregate level. But at the micro level, companies are asking, why is it that a individual customer, an individual account, how does that account behave differently if they're a promoter versus a detractor? And you need to understand that. And that's going to be a complex and a non-simple relationship. You're going to have detractors who stay, maybe because they're hostaged. You're going to have promoters who leave. And so there's not so a simple one-to-one connection between economic value, detractors, and promoters. That relationship is more complex. And the closer you get to understanding how this works, long-term versus short-term, the more capable you are in helping business leaders understand how they should use these two types of measurement, financial measurements and CX measurements. And the right answer at the end of the day for almost every company I've seen achieve success is that they are parallel views of the customer that converge over a long term. So over the long term, companies that demonstrate higher levels of CX outperform in terms of growth, financial profitability. The best customers they have, measured as detractors, do in the medium to long term generate the bulk of the profits, have a lower cost to serve. But in the short term, you're going to see divergence created by these disconnects because maybe you have customers who are on long-term contracts or they're hostaged, or it's all relative to your competition. And even though you've got a good NPS, you're falling behind competition in short term. So that's a complex answer. But I would argue that today, quality analytics organizations, quality CX organizations need to answer that question. And if you're not doing the heavy lifting work to build the analytics and the understanding, you're not really running a CX program. You're not doing your job by skipping out on the heavy lift of connecting this to financials.
Okay, perfectly clear. Richard, and what is your take regarding culture? Because I noticed that you are very focused into the data and the completeness of it to take business decisions. But at the end of the day, as Peter Drucker mentioned, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So how would, in your experience, how do the C-level, the CEO, leads the culture, the transformation of the culture into a CX organization?
That's a great question. And it's probably one of the hardest challenges leadership faces. If you're in a company that doesn't have a customer-centric organization, changing into being customer-centric is a colossal undertaking, and it takes many years. And we shouldn't kid ourselves. It's not going to happen overnight, because if you've got thousands of employees who believe that the best way to achieve their jobs is X, and now you're saying, well, maybe not, maybe it's Y. That's not going to happen overnight. So how do you embark on such a large cultural transformation? Well, I think there are 2 or 3 key things that you can do. And I think we talked about NPS as measurement. Accountability is critical. Communication is critical. I think educating the organization to why this is important. And then modeling good and successful behavior. So you're absolutely right that culture tends to eat strategy for lunch. Let me draw something economists love to do, and I apologize, I'm a recovering economist, so I tend to draw on these stories. Think about the distinction between economic norms and social norms. And what we mean by that is economic norms are kind of what we pay people to do, and social norms are what people do because that's just the family rules. Top performing CX companies have employees who do customer-centric behavior because they are the family rules for the business. This is how we roll as a company. Poorer performing companies do it because I'm being paid to do it. Now, there's problems in designing compensation schemes that are perfect. So if all people are doing is becoming customer-centric because they are being paid to be customer-centric, for example, incentivizing NPS performance financially, they won't do exactly the right thing all the time. They will, in fact, simply literally follow some coded compensation rules, and you'll get all kinds of weird behavior to deal with, including cheating, by the way, including breaking some of the rules for how to calculate NPS. If you can create social norms where they're the family rules, then you have the opposite effect. You have employees doing the right thing even when no one's paying them to do it, doing the right thing even when no one's watching. So we want to create these great social norms. So how do we do that? Well, we reward demonstrable behavior that links to that. We find examples of great behavior within the organization. We hold people accountable without linking that accountability so precisely to money that we say, the only reason you're doing this is because you're getting paid. No, the reason you're doing this is because it's the right thing to do. And that example of Charles Schwab saying, look, at the end of the day, I'm not in this, I'm not building Schwab around customers because it's just a great business strategy or it's profitable. I'm doing it because it's the right way to build a company. And if you can instill that idea in employees, I think it works very, very well. It takes the whole leadership team to believe in this. If you're sitting around the C-suite and you've got 9 direct reports, say I'm making this up, 5 of them are all in and 4 of them are skeptical or they don't want to go along with it, you're not going to get the organization moving in the right direction. You need a degree of unanimity at the executive level. And a lot of what I've found, and I'm sure you found this experience as well, is that the dysfunction or the function alignment around culture starts in the C-suite, right? It starts in the executive staff, and getting the executive staff to understand what it takes and aligned behind the idea of creating a customer-centric culture. And honestly, if you get that, and you get the other mechanisms in place, the organization will follow. Most dysfunctional organizations are dysfunctional at the top. So big topic, but I think that's what we see a lot of the time, which is messaging, a correct way of framing this as an objective, alignment at the C-suite. These are the basics, and you get the basics right, the organization follows. Thanks for listening to the CX Iconoclast from OCX Cognition. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you won't miss any of our thought-provoking conversations. And please get in touch if you want to learn more about what OCX Cognition's predictive CX analytics platform can do for your business by providing complete insights into every account, continuously updated and connected to operations. You'll find contact info in the show notes.